Welcome, everyone. My name is Elena Brandt. I am the membership secretary of ASTM F43. ASTM F43 is a technical committee of ASTM International that writes and maintains international standards related to language, services, and products. Today, we're here with Steve Lank, who is the CEO of Chesco Linguistic Services. We're also here with David Hubel, who is the president of Orion Assessment Services. We're going to talk a little bit about a new certification to an ASTM F43 standard that's available to the F2575 standard. That standard is called Standard Practice for Quality Assurance and Translation. So during this conversation, we're going to go through the history of the standard. We're going to talk about the development of audits so that companies can get certified to standards. We're going to talk as well about Chesco's certification through Orion, and Chesco is the first company to become certified to the standard. Orion is the first company to certify a company to the standard. So congratulations to you both. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Steve, you are the chair of the F4303 Language Translation Subcommittee that is responsible for this F2575 standard, and you've worked on the standard since it was first written. So I'm excited to hear from you, your perspective on the standard, especially the history of the standard, because I don't think I've actually ever talked to you about that before. You know, we talk about standards a lot, and it's nice to discover things that maybe we haven't talked about before. But can we start with what are some of the key points of the F2575 standard?
Okay, just one point of clarification, just for the beginning. We actually changed the name of the standard when we moved to a practice, so it's now called the Standard Practice for Language Translation.
Perfect.
Because it sort of reflects and mirrors the title of our sister standard, F2089, for interpreting. So F2575, I've been working on this since 1998, so it's near and dear to my heart. The key points of the standard really are just a list of best practices for the industry, sort of to get everything down on paper for people to see. And that's what all standards do, basically, right? Is to provide you best practices. But it also provides sort of a common language for people to use when they're talking about it, particularly for procurers or requesters, as they're called in the standard of translation and localization services, who aren't familiar with the processes and procedures, and indeed, in many cases, are unable to sort of evaluate the quality of the service that they're providing themselves because it's in a language that they don't understand necessarily. So having that common language, giving them a sense of how to, that gives them a tool to decide who they should work with, how to find a provider that's going to be able to give them what they need. And it also tells them about the things that they need to be able to do up front, or they need to know up front about their project in order to even be able to choose a provider, right? So they go through a needs analysis, they go through a risk analysis. There's a section in the standard that's specifically about choosing a service provider, whether it's an individual or a company, and how they can evaluate or determine whether or not the provider that they choose has the competencies to do the work that they need to have done, right? So, which is super helpful to a requester, again, who is unfamiliar with the process and how language essentially works. But the key to the standard, and what everything is sort of hung off of in F2575, is the specification section, which is section 8 of the standard. That basically is a part in the standard where the client and the provider, the requester and the provider, sit down and decide how they're going to approach the project, right? What they're going to do, they go through what all the best practices are, what all the steps are, what the needs of requirements of the project are, and agree how they are going to go about coming to a final product. And in F2575 parlance, if you deliver to standard, you've delivered the level of quality that the client needs, right? So the quality in under the standard means that you have agreed on how you're going to do it, you're applying best practices, and you've adhered to those specifications. And essentially, you know, it's broken down into three parts after you've gone through those analyses and the determination of you choosing your provider and basically what the overview of a project is. But it's the pre-production phase or the specification phase is where you decide together what you're going to do. So that's where you decide what you're going to do. Section 9 is the production phase where you do what you said you're going to do. And then section 10 is a review of that process, the post-production phase, to confirm that you did what you said you were going to do. So that's sort of F2575 in a nutshell.
That's great, because something we talk about a lot in translation and localization and interpreting as well is that, you know, quality is so subjective. And so if you don't take the time to establish what quality means for a specific organization in advance, there's a very high likelihood that you have your ideas about what quality is. They have different ideas about what quality is. The people on your team have different ideas about what quality is, because each person in that production chain, you know, they have their own needs, they have their own objectives. And so getting that all down on paper in advance just really sets everyone up for success when it comes to producing language services.
And I think that's true. I mean, I think that what I love about F2575 is just that section, because it's essentially a checklist of things that you need to go through with your client. Now, not every single thing that's in there is going to apply to every single project that you do or to every single client, but it's a checklist of things to remind yourself of what you need to talk about. And some of those conversations can take 5 minutes. The client says, do what you think is best. Done.
Yeah.
But for ones who are going to be much more involved, it really helps you get through and touch on all aspects of it that are important to both sides to ensure that you produce the product that's required.
Something I like talking to you about standards, and something that I've learned from you over the years about standards, is that one of the advantages of them are the revision cycles that they go through. So, you know, a standard is written for the first time, it sets a foundation, but there's also this idea that it's going to be revised every, you know, 5 to 8 years or something like that within ASTM, so that it can be updated to reflect what's happening currently in the market. So could you talk about how F2575 has developed over the years? Like, what are the major changes maybe that have taken place in the various versions that there have been?
Sure. Okay. So, you know, as I said before, we started the process of developing the standards. Standards development is a slow process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So we started in 1998. And the first version of F2575 wasn't published until 2006. So we had 8 years, and so we took 8 years to get it done. And it's super important. You know, in ASTM, you have to have a balance of participants. So it's not just one group of people, the providers who are writing these standards. You have to have people that are federal interest. You have to have people that are procurers of the service to sort of make sure that there's balance there, which is why I think ASTM standards, they can take so long to develop, but they also, it makes them much more, I think, detailed, and they're much more detailed, and they can sort of hold their value for longer because there's been some conversation. So when we started out, there's you know, multiple options of different types of standards that you can have. There's, you know, and we started out with what you call a standard guide, which is basically guidance on sort of, you know, as sort of defined by best practices about how you should go about providing a service. It doesn't dictate what you have to do, but it provides best practices for requesters and providers at large about, you know, the steps that you need to take to provide, that you should take to provide a quality project, but it doesn't dictate what you have to do. And the reason that we did that is it's easier to sort of gain traction and attention to your standard and buy into your standard if you start that way. You're not dictating people right away. You give people time to get used to it, what's out there, to understand what they might have to tweak in their own process in order to be able to comply, right? So we kept it as a standard guide to begin with, because we knew that, you know, standardization, at least, you know, in the translation space in the US, was new. So in 2000, so within ASTM, you have to update at least every 8 years, or your standard drops off. So that meant that we had to have something to update in 2014. Now, we needed to do a review of it because that's the requirement. There wasn't anything major that we wanted to do. In the new version, we were gaining some traction. We were starting to get some recognition in the public sector space, and we started to see ASTM mentioned a little bit in RFPs, not a ton.
Yeah.
But there was still a little bit of pushback from the industry itself about, exactly how you get things done and getting the buy-in there. So recognition on one side, still a little bit of pressure on the other side, pushback on the other side. So we kept it as a standard guide in the 2014 edition, but just tightened up Section 8. So it was a minor update. We focused on Section 8 because there were parts of Section 8, which is the key, as I was telling you. It's the specification section of the standard, to make sure that it was super clear to everybody what the steps were.
Yeah.
But then this new one, come 2023, we upgraded it again, we updated again, and there's some significant changes. So from 2014 to and we started almost immediately after 2014 got published, we started our discussions about revisions for what was to come, which we needed to have done with balloting by the end of 2022. And it was decided at that point that we had gained enough traction. We're starting to see more and more references to ASTM, but it really wasn't going to be something that people, you can comply with it, but clients want to see a certification, right? So it wasn't, so we wanted to do something that was going to give it more teeth. So we converted it to a practice, which still can have some guidance within it that says you should do this or you could do this, but in a standard practice, there's things that you have to do, right? There's a lot of shalls, and David can tell you more about the shalls in a standard. So that's what we did here. We also, added a few different sections. We added the needs analysis section to mirror more closely what we were doing in the interpreting standard. There's information in there on risk analysis. We also did a big revision of the workflow that was in there. We had a very, very basic workflow that's kind of went in a circle in the first two versions for the translation process, but it almost made the process seem too simple, right? It didn't really describe well, in order to make it more understandable from a lay audience, we oversimplified it to the point where we're like, oh, this is super simple. So we put a new workflow in that is a swim lane diagram that's super detailed, that indicates all the different steps in the process, all the different phases, but also all of the different roles that could be involved in any given project, that we think better reflects the complexity of a translation or localization project. And then finally, another addition was a reference to translation grades and translation labels, which are kind of were a little bit controversial to put in, but were things that we felt were very important. The concept of grades is a reference to levels of quality, which nobody in translation likes to talk about, but we had to acknowledge what clients were looking to purchase based on what their needs were and what the profile was of their project. Now, F2575 assumes high-grade human-based translation, but it needed to acknowledge that these others exist. So there's reference to grades there. And we also added a reference to translation labels, which, with more and more technology coming into the workflow, we felt that it was important to suggest that requesters who are publishing translations label them to show whether they are fully automated, machine translation, or if there was a human in the loop, so that were bilingually edited, right? So as a question of consumer protection and transparency. So that was also added. That conversation has developed since we published in 2023, and we're actually going to be doing a small upgrade We're going to ballot a small change uh, to F2575 around labels because we feel that the labels that are in there right now are it's too binary. So we needed to broaden that a little bit and make it also more specific. So that is going to be balloted hopefully this quarter.
That's fantastic. And I think when it comes to the labels too, it's been interesting from my perspective, because I got involved in standards maybe like 7 or 8 years ago or something like that. So it's interesting to hear about the things that happened before I, was following along. And to have seen what's happening around the labels development is really interesting to me, because it very much demonstrates this idea of the values behind standards, where there's a consensus-based approach where we want to achieve wide participation. And so I know that experts like Dr. Alan Melby have been going around to conferences and just gathering feedback on what people think about these labels, to try to make sure that many, many different people's perspectives are taken into consideration, so that this idea of taking many people's perspectives into consideration, the more and the wider range of people that you consult on a topic, you better ensure that just any gaps in thinking are addressed, because people have different areas of expertise. They have different ways of viewing the process. And so it's really interesting to hear, that you put a foundational section into the last revision on labels for that sense of consumer protection that you're talking about, where, if I'm reading a medical device manual and that's been completely machine translated, I would like to know that there's a pretty large risk that I'm going to use the device in an incorrect way because a human professional hasn't verified the content. It just sounds fantastic that, you got a foundational piece of knowledge in there with the labels, and that now you're updating them to, address these conversations that have been happening on the industry.
Well, in Dr. Melby's, as you said, Dr. Melby's input on this and his leadership on this portion of the standard has been invaluable. I mean, he's very well connected, and he's sort of gone on a one-man world tour to get this buy-in, because it's important to have that buy-in if you're going to have something in a standard. And it was on he was one of the main reasons that we got it into the standard in the first place, and he's continued to develop this conversation. And the beauty of the standards, at least under the ASTM process, these are living documents, right? It's not like the idea is not that, okay, the standard is here for the next 8 years, this is it. If you find something within it that needs to develop, you can ballot those things separately, right? So, which is what we're doing here. So it's not the whole standard that's going to go out for ballot. It's this again, because the thinking on it, because of Dr. Melby's, outreach to the community, we've found that there's a better way to approach it, and we want to make sure that that is in the standard. And the same type of thing happens anytime you reference technology in a standard. Technology moves so much faster than standards do, so you have to be careful about how you reference that. So a lot of the stuff that we do refers out to other documents, where those things, the reference is always going to be there, reference out, but it allows it to sort of develop outside as well, which is another thing that Dr. Melby was very critical in helping us set up, because otherwise, it was going to make us you would have to be going through a review process every couple of years, right? And if you keep doing that, then people stop paying attention, right? Because then you're making changes too frequently, and it doesn't allow people to sort of absorb what they've already got. So this is it. The setup that we have with ASTM and our ability to just ballot this one item is super helpful.
Is there anything else you want to say about the F2575 standard before we move on to certification to translation standards, Steve?
Just that, I'm a super fan, and everybody should acquire it and read it and follow it, right? If you're going to be in this industry, it's a standard that you need to have.
Yeah, I think my advice typically for when I teach right now, and I'm based out of Mexico City. I'm teaching at the Intercontinental University. So they've read the F2575 standard in my class. And my advice is always that, if you want to participate in the industry, you should know the best practices of the industry. And so um, I hope it becomes, just required reading for companies and educational programs more and more as time goes on.
That is
Uh,
certainly a hope, yes.
yeah. We'll move on to certification to translation standards. And I'm really excited to get some clarifications around the differences between things like a certification program and an audit program from you, David. But could you start off by just telling us about Orion Assessment Services and the kind of services your company provides?
Oh, for sure. And thank you for having me on board with the session, by the way. And so looking
Yes.
forward to helping clarify a lot of information around the certifications and the standards and the various processes. So for me personally, I've been involved with standards. I'm going on 30 years now, I believe it is. So I've been involved in everything from helping write standards, audit standards, developing certification programs. I've worked with thousands of companies across all different industry sectors. So there's quite a few aspects I've seen. And it's always interesting because I always love the language industry. Like I remember years ago, the first company I worked with in terms of certification. I learned a lot about the industry. It got me all pumped up about it. And actually, that's why us Orion is a certification body. That's one of the verticals we have as a language services sector. So for our company, we were established back in 2007, and we essentially certify companies to national, international, and sometimes industry standards as well. So, for example, there's some associations where they roll out various standards that they have themselves and that they want to implement internally. But given they are associations, they can't audit their own membership because it's deemed a conflict of interest. So we come in there as the provider that helps them set up, establish, and certify them. So we do a lot of the standards you might hear of course, the ASTM, which is what we're talking about today. We do some of the various other standards like the ISO 9000, the health and safety one, the environmental, the cybersecurity one, which is 27001. And for a lot of the bigger standards, we're accredited for those ones as well. So it gives some extra punch behind the certification as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we're currently working a lot with the language sector. To add on Steve's note about standards development, I was part of the ASTM. And the reason I love jumping on the standards committee when it's one we're especially going to look at certifying is just making sure it's an audible document. So I remember in the past, I've been through some of the standards and I've looked at them and we've chosen not to certify them because there just isn't anything in there for us. Because I think the writers didn't think, okay, if somebody has to audit, what do they need to see? So when you get into words like shells and musts, you have to do it. And shoulds and mays are things you don't have to do, right? So it has to be an audible document. So it has to have shells, it has to have documents, it has to have records, it has to have proof and items that we can verify. And if it's not written with that in place, then it's not a good standard for us to work with and to be certified. So I was happy to be a part of the ASTM because I know that's definitely some standards we can actually effectively audit to.
I tend to prefer the ASTM standards to the ISO standards. I think there's a lot of really good information in ISO standards, but they seem a little bit more general in my view than the ASTM standards, where it's a little, as Steve was saying before, it's a little bit more detailed.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, like the ISO tend to be more generic because you're hitting an international community. So quite often, it's a great idea for the two to refer to each other's standards when writing it, because you can run into many cases like we do, for example, where a company wants an ISO standard and they want an ASTM standard, but we can do them both at the same time because we're following the same processes and we work through it. So it's like anything. If you have best practices in different areas, why wouldn't you look at it and get yourself some ideas when you're rolling out that standard and be more specific? And with the ASTM one, it's when you get ones like that standard, it tends to be more focused, a narrow focus. It tends to have a bit more specific requirements in there than you might have from a general overall standard as well.
Yeah, I suppose it's good to think from both perspectives. So I shouldn't say that the ASTM standards are better by any means, but they are more specific in my view.
Yeah, they're more robust in some areas for sure.
Yeah. So could you clarify something for me is, does your
Sure.
company develop certifications, or do you develop audits via which companies can become certified? How does that all work?
Okay, so we're what you call a certification body. So when somebody has a standard that they want to establish a certification scheme to, is they come to us and we would set up the whole scheme, the whole mechanism that we have to audit and to certify them. So for us, for example, there's probably at least, I'd say about 15 to 20 different standards that we audit to right now.
Hmm.
So in terms of the way that we run is it's essentially one project management process, one way of doing things, but we basically tack on different standards depending on the need as it goes through. So we take it from the time that you have a standard ready and you want to have it certified, or a company wants to be certified to it, and we take it down that path.
So you can certify LSCs to two of the F43 standards. There's the F3130 standard that's for language service companies. That was the first certifiable ASTM standard, if I'm not mistaken. And now
Okay.
there's the certification to the F2575 standard. So when you're first developing like an audit program for organizations to become certified to a standard, what does that look like from your side?
So when we get the standard, the first thing that I do, of course, is look at it and say, is this a good standard? Can we certify to the standard? Does it make sense? Do people want it? So we look at the need, we look at the standard, we see what's involved with it. And if we decide it's something to work with, then what we essentially end up doing is we first get the standard, we understand the requirements, we have to develop our internal documentation. So when our auditors go out and certify clients, they have to know what they're looking at, what they have to find. So we essentially develop an internal checklist for them to work with. And then the next step is the training internally. So we have to make sure that the auditors that are going in are competent, know the standard, know the requirements. But in this particular industry, since we work with over 300 companies in the language service sector, so our auditors tend to know, all the terminology, the typical platforms that they work with. So when they go in to see the clients, you're not explaining and training them. They know your industry, they know the sector. But again, when we start working with the different ASTM standards, they have to get specific training and they have to know and understand that standard before they can come in and certify somebody to it. So aside from that, because we do so many standards, the project management system, it's all the same. I assign somebody for an ISO standard, I assign somebody to an audit for an ASTM standard. It's a different competency, slightly different report that goes to it, but it's the same process for fulfilling that. So it's very scalable for us.
I want to highlight a couple really important things that you said out of all of the important things that you said. One of the things that you said when you're looking at starting a certification is, do people want it? And so I want to stress that when it comes to ASTM standards as well, this isn't like some small committee that says, oh, we think it would be a good idea to have a standard on this, without there being a call from the industry for that type of standard. So from the perspective that I have of working within ASTM F43, it's not something, a standard isn't something that necessarily bubbles up from a very small committee of people. It's a need that's being expressed in the industry that then the committee is in charge of sort of monitoring that area of the market to say, okay, it sounds like we need some guidelines, some recommendations about this. I think that's a very important piece that you highlighted there. Another thing when it comes to working with those 300 companies, because I've had clients that have asked me for help with figuring out what company might be a good one to go with in order to get certified. And in that experience, some of the reporting back that I've heard, if there's like a team or something that's doing research on different companies, well, why did this company just say essentially they can give us a rubber stamp? If we pay a certain amount of money, they're just going to stamp and say we have that certification. But this other company is saying that, we're going to have to go through a robust process. And so I think there's an important aspect of the spirit of standards, that in the spirit of certification, that if you're, looking at it as a rubber stamp to say that, you're just getting it to put that label on your organization. That's certainly one goal. But could you maybe talk about the broader goal of just like continuous improvement in certifications?
Sure, sure. I can talk about that in a second, but just one point on just the auditing itself. I remember, without mentioning names, I was listening to a webinar once and somebody else doing an overview of one of the translation specific standards. And they said, oh, the firm comes in, whoever the audit firm was, they spend like an hour and a half, they have lunch, they go out, and then they're certified. And I was shocked by that. And as soon as I heard that, I never recognized any certifications from that certification body. For it to be credible, you have to go in, you have to interview the staff involved, you have to look at the records, you have to verify the process is up, it's running, it's implemented, and you can't do that. It's impossible to certify somebody to a standard within 2 hours. For us, typically, the audits, we go through the standards are a day, and that a day minimum, and that allows us to effectively go through all the processes to verify everything's in place. Now, in terms of your question was around continuous improvement, right? So most of the standards involve and they push for continuous improvement. So the fact that you're implementing the standard, essentially when you work through your processes and you're looking at the standard and comparing the two, it really forces you to look at everything you do and question what you're doing. Like, what am I doing? How am I doing it? Why am I doing it? Why am I doing it at all? So it really gives you that opportunity to really understand your process and fine tune it. So one of the biggest continuous improvement items or improvements that people do is it forces them to rethink everything and to go through everything in detail. And I think that's one of the best things you can do for continuous improvement. And now a lot of the other standards themselves, they have it's not, I don't believe it's in the ASTM, Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, but they force you to do internal audits. So an internal audit is basically an annual review of what you do to make sure you're following it and you're still in compliance. And that sort of mechanism should be done regardless of the standard, because then again, it forces you to go back and look at everything anyways. And you can take feedback, like, how did the process work this year? What did we like? What didn't we like? Are there any changing requirements from customers? And you can take all that information and you can blend it back into your process and enhance and improvement. So continuous improvement should be part of everything you do anyways. So well-run organizations, they don't sit still. They're proactive, they're on top of things. And even the fact that Steve there went for the 2575, he wanted to get those best practices, he wanted to improve, he wanted to embed these key requirements into what he was doing. And that's all part of that whole continuous improvement approach.
I think so too. And I've taught classes on quality management, for example, where we talk about doing internal audits as part of the overall process, because, you can say we follow the best practices and everyone on the team follows the best practices. If you're, scaling up, you start with yourself and a few project managers maybe. And so, for sure that everyone is following the best practices. But as you get bigger and bigger, there's more opportunity for people to not out of any sense of, wanting to be cut corners or things like that, but just maybe because they don't know. And so if you're doing these internal audits and if you're going through certifications, this also is an opportunity to identify just areas where maybe more training is needed, where you can improve the business. It's not at all. That's what I really like about the certifications and audits and things like that. It's not a spirit of going in and telling somebody, you're doing this wrong, you're doing bad. This is where you are. This is how you can get better.
Well, exactly. And that's where my auditors have lots of experience, because they will look through the processes and they'll just say, oh, that doesn't appear to be the most efficient way. You might want to consider reviewing that area again and making enhancements for, A, B, C, or whatever it is. So they're not allowed to tell you how to do anything, but they can give you ideas of areas that you need to look at to enhance, which is key. Everybody likes that. Even us, when we get our external accreditation audits, we look to see if there's any improvement or any suggestions they're not clear about, because if they're not clear about it, chances are somebody else is not clear about it. So you can always use those as your framework for improvement.
And I think too, that's just why it's so important, if you're going to get a certification to translation standards, to be working with a company who does the audits, who has a lot of experience working with translation companies. You're going to have a better experience that way. You're going to get a lot more value added that way. David, is there any last thing you'd like to say about certification in general or certification to translation standards before we talk about the specific process that you went through with Chesco?
I'm not sure what else to add there. I think we've covered a lot of good key points there. So.
Perfect. Then we can go on to just, for language service companies that may be interested in getting a certification, it seems like it would be beneficial for us to just talk about the process and the process that Chesco just went through specifically for this F2575 standard. So Steve, you decided you wanted this certification. When you approach Orion, what sort of information do you give to start, or how does the whole process kick off?
Well, David can tell you that I hounded him mercilessly. No, I'm not somebody who likes I like clarity, right? So I want to know what I want to expect. David and his team were fantastic. I mean, I knew that I wanted to be certified against the standard. I knew that David's team had already done 3130, and we wanted to do that one as well. So it made sense for us to go to him to talk to him about this. I have been involved. I've been in other companies who were ISO certified, but I've never and been in the process, in the auditing process before. But I've never been in a company that been working in standards for so long who was getting certified for the first time against a language standard. I've been in companies that got certified for the general quality standard.
Yeah.
So, David gave me some information about what to expect, how much time it was going to take, but really it's just know the standard and be ready to sort of check yourself to make sure that the beauty of, the beauty of F2575 is, as I said, it basically gives you a checklist. So you have to know the standard, and you have to know what types of evidence you have to sort of support the work that you're doing, right? So that's how we basically train for it. I mean, David talked me through the process, but you can't give all of everything away to me, right? So basically it's a question of preparation. So essentially, if you're following the standard and you have your documentation in place, you should be prepared. We started preparing a year in advance to make sure that everything was in place. And the whole, what David was saying earlier about making sure that everything is documented and going through your process is a whole continuous improvement thing. That was one of the most valuable parts, was just re-engaging with everybody and refocusing on our processes and procedures and making sure that everything was documented, and everybody was sort of really got on board with it. So it was really fantastic. But we also engaged with a consultant to help us who'd been through the process before. I'm all about, I think David told me at one time, I think you're over preparing, but I'm like, no, I'm going to make sure I'm prepared. So we engaged with a consultant, helped us, who'd been through the process before with her company, with other different standards, not necessarily the same ones, but just what did she do to prepare. And this was Lisa Blasson at TBO, Charles Campbell's company, and she was fantastic. I mean, I had spoken with her at the first Juntos event on standards, and I was really sort of impressed by her approach to standards and just managing this whole process. And she just worked with us to make sure that everything was documented, and she would go through our process, what made sense to us in our heads, did it make sense on paper, and could she follow it? And so from January to January, basically, we were working on this, just making sure that making sure that everything was documented, that everybody knew where everything was, preparing people to be audited. It just made the whole process so easy. And the auditor that David assigned to us, Carol, was fabulous. She only asked me for one thing in advance. She just asked me for our org chart. And so she asked for the org chart to get a sense of what the company was like and who was doing what. And then she based her whole schedule around the people that she wanted to talk to based on the org chart. And then we provided her documentation as we went and as she sat with people. And I don't know if you've ever been involved in an audit yourself, but people always just the word audit stresses people out so much. They just
Yeah.
get so worried. Even super professional people who know their work backwards and forwards, but they have this sense that somebody's from the outside is coming in to catch them out and doing something wrong, right?
Yeah.
So people were super nervous, and I've been in companies where people like they couldn't do it. They wouldn't be at work that day. But Carol was fabulous. She just put everybody really at ease, and which allowed them to really just demonstrate what they knew and everything. And so the process was super pleasant. We spent, we were certified against 3 standards during that process. We spent 3 days.
Well done.
We spent 3 days with Carol. She gave us some really great feedback, some suggestions for things that we could improve on in the future. But it just, the whole process was super. Once I got over my anxiety, because there would be nothing more embarrassing than having written the standard and not passing. The audit, that could happen.
There's a lot of pressure there for Steve.
I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
No, but it was, and what I loved about it is that everybody had a great experience. All I think that within our organization, there were probably 10 people that Carol sat down with. Everybody was super well prepared. The feedback that I got from her on them and them on her was all super positive, and it made everybody, super proud of what we've been doing, and sort of, and it was great to have somebody from the outside come in and validate that for them, particularly in an organization, smaller organization with ours. We have a certain core group of people who are very established, have been in the industry for a long time, but also a group of people who are new to the industry, who this is their first job, right?
Yeah.
And they know what they know from working with us, right? And so it's like parents telling a kid, this is what you should do, and the kid's going, what? And then somebody else comes in and says, oh, what you should do, and you're like, oh, of course. So it was perfect because it validated what we've been saying and the processes that we've been following. And I think it made the staff and just sort of believers about the power of that, and about preparation, and the reason why we're such sticklers for how we do things, and being able to back up a decision that you made. I mean, I think one of the things that I was sort of taught from the beginning about standards and being audited is, but the auditor is not going. You can correct me here, David, if I'm wrong, but it's not the job of the auditor to come in they're not coming in to catch you out on something or to tell you that you're doing something wrong. They're coming in to check to make sure that you have processes in place, that the processes adhere to the standard, and that you're following those processes. So if you make an exception to something that you've done in a project for some reason, if you know that it's an exception and you can justify the exception to the satisfaction of the auditor, that's okay. What's not okay is to have done something one way because you didn't know what the process was, right? Yeah. So, and that, I had been sort of preaching that to everybody for the last year, getting them up and running, going through and checking all of their documented process with the fine-tooth comb, and making sure that that everything was in order. And they're like, what is wrong with him? But then when it came to the audit, they were all like, oh, this preparation was exactly what we needed. So, and I think, having been through the process once now and documenting everything, everybody's sort of in that mode now of when they have ideas for things that could be changed, of making sure that we start implementing those things early on. And I think it's really going to set us up for the next thing, because we have, aspirations to be certified against some of the interpreting standards now. And I would love to work with David and his team on F2575 as well. But I think that, now that we've been through the process, we know what to expect, we know how to prepare. I won't say that it's going to be a cakewalk, but I think it's going to be much easier, and there's going to be a lot less anxiety around it than there could possibly be. But I'm telling you, I've been through other processes with audits in a number of different companies, and this has been the most pleasant one. I mean, it's been, Carol was fantastic. She just put everybody at ease. And it just made the whole process run much more smooth. This is not to say that she was easy on us. I don't think that that's true. I just think that her approach and her sort of interpersonal skills really helped. Because it does make people anxious when they hear that they're being audited. And it was a phenomenal experience for us from our perspective.
Great. Well, thanks for the feedback, Steve. Definitely going to pass it along to Carol for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the things, just a quick thing, like that I get asked a lot is, well, how much documentation do I need for the audit? And it goes together with your point, Steve, about when are we ready? So with all the standards, typically the amount and level of documentation, the complexity of it is really established by the organization. So if you have a big company, you have high turnover, you have a lot of really complicated processes, then you might want to have more documentation to support your training program. And that's the key thing, is to support your training program in terms of bringing people up to speed. But if you have everything that's embedded and managed, for example, by some sort of software which has controls in place to define exactly what you do, how you enter it, how it works, then maybe your level of documentation and supporting information is less. So it's really up to the organization to determine that. But when you go through the standard, the main thing you have to do is highlight the words documents, records, or documented information, because those are the things that are mandatory and the auditor will be looking for. And I know when we go through some standards, for example, they might say things like, you have to have terms and conditions. I can think of one standard, and then it points you to the annex at the back and says terms and conditions may include. So the big word is may include, right? So what it means is, from the audit side, is if somebody has terms and conditions and it's 2 sentences, it's not really meeting the intent, but still, does it pass the standard? Are they terms and conditions? Probably, but the best practices are typically what's embedded in the back of it. So when you're going through, what do I need to have for the audit? You should always pay very particular attention to shalls, musts, documents, records, and the evidence that you have to have. And that will make your whole journey a lot smoother when you do that. And when you get to that point too, like Steve mentioned, when you're ready to go, sometimes you just got to bite the bullet. I mean, you know, how often I've done this, even when we've had stuff in the past, and like, I don't know if we're ready, because I'm a bit more of a perfectionist. It sounds like Steve's the same. So you want everything 100%. But at the end of the day, you just got to just jump in, go do it. Right. And then if any small issues come up, you just fix them and you move on to certification. So it's very, sometimes people get hesitant with that, but at the end of the day, when you've done what you need to do, I would just say, just jump in and go for it.
David, how often do people have to get re-audited to maintain a certification?
Okay, great question. Now it depends on the standard. So when you're dealing with the scheme that we have for the ASTM standards, and some of the language specific industry standards like the 17100, the 18587, those ones are every 2 years, and we do full audit and recertification. When you do the standards that are mandated by the some of the accreditations, like the 9001, the environmental one, the cyber, those ones, they have to be done annually.
Hmm. Steve, are you going to say something?
No, I would no. No, I was just thinking to myself, an annual audit that would probably kill me, but
Yeah, it's not needed in those standards, Steve.
that was just a comment.
That's great though, because with the ISO standards, I was thinking like something like 27001, the data security standard. Those are great complementary ones that like language service companies need to, obviously we're housing a lot of personally identifiable information. And so.
Yeah, that's one I'm getting asked for a lot these days, just because with people dealing with government, they're dealing with, healthcare records, they're dealing with financial institutions. They're asking, what are you doing to protect the information that I'm sending to you, right? So this 27001 is becoming very popular with anybody who hosts sensitive information. And even, I don't know about you, but when I go through my cyber security insurance as well, they ask all the questions about that anyways too. What do you have do you do TFA? Do you do this? Do you do that? So it's kind of like a pseudo checkup and questions that you have to demonstrate what you have in place so that you can get reduced rates and you're a lower risk for them.
Yeah. Well, I think some key takeaways that I've heard about the benefits of certifications to F2575 specifically, and just to certifications in general, is that I think both of you touched upon the fact that for companies that are not only, wanting to demonstrate that they follow best practices, but also bring up new leaders in the industry. You know, you can't rely on, well, you rely on for a very long time your veterans in a program. You also want to be bringing up other people who can take the reins and follow best practices and, you know, eventually take positions of leadership. I think a point that was a really good one that you made, Steve, was just about people being able to feel proud about their work.
Yeah.
I remember being a project manager at a language service company, and I would not hear about it when things went well. I would hear about it when things were going wrong. And so maybe the times that things go wrong are like, you know, 5% of the time, 3% of the time, but yet that was most of the feedback I was getting. This 3 to 5% of the time things went wrong. And while it's certainly good to learn from mistakes, and I'm a big, especially because I teach, I understand that mistakes are the way that we learn. You have to make mistakes to be able to learn. But at the same time, there's something very nice about receiving encouragement. And, you know, you want to tell people when they're doing things well too, so they keep doing the things well. People, if you have a set of rules in place and nobody's checking that anyone's following the rules, or nobody's saying, hey, great job, you've been performing really, really well here, performance may drop because people like to receive encouragement. So those are some of the benefits, you know, out of many that I see out of certifications. I wonder if,
I would also say that I think that, you know, those things are all true. And I also think that from a requester perspective, a buyer perspective, particularly for organizations who are themselves certified to a standard in their industry, it kind of gives, it's kind of a shorthand for them. You know, it helps them choose a provider. You know, if they can't understand exactly what it is that you're providing, they understand what the ASTM or the ISO process is because they follow a standard themselves. So it gives them a sense that I mean, if they're comparing you to somebody who doesn't have a certification, that might help them make their choice. Plus the fact that, you know, you're being audited by a third party. So it's not you saying that I'm compliant, self-certified. It's helpful to have gone through the process of having somebody from opening up everything to an outside party to verify that you're doing what you say you're going to do. So I think that that's a very powerful tool from a buyer perspective as well.
Oh yeah, I think so too, because it helps shortlist them, right? So if I go out and I Google and say, find me a translation service provider, I'm probably going to get a ton of them.
Yeah.
So how do I know if it's, you know, Bob working out of his basement with using who we know, or if it's a good reputable firm like Steve, who's got processes, systems in place, he's got people with the core competencies, it's well thought out, right? So I think standards are often a great way to shortlist your buyer selection so that you know that who you're buying from is credible. Like, for example, like the ASTM 3130, there's a lot of infrastructure controls in place. So it's a great way to differentiate between a true service language company versus, you know, somebody, again, working out of the basement, you don't know who they are, because it has infrastructure requirements like insurance and revenue and all these other things. And then the 2575 is obviously, Steve went through that in more detail, so I won't, but it just basically ensures that you have processes to fill the customer's requirements and that everything's known and understood up front. So when you deliver it on the back end, that they're getting a good product, they've met the requirements, and they got exactly what they paid for. So, so that's why I think standards are a great way to like know who you're buying from, essentially.
Thank you so much to both of you for your time today. I know you have very busy schedules, and I just appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me to talk about this standard. Any last thing you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
I would just say quickly that if you're a language service company who have been considering doing it, I just think you need to sort of, I mean, if you've got processes in place, you're really going to be fine, right? I mean, it's, you know, if you're starting from scratch, you're going to want to wait. But I think that if you got a fear that, you know, that you're not going to pass, I mean, I think just going through the process of verifying your documentation and your processes is a super valuable part of the certification process in the first place, and you have to go through that to get there. And once you get to that point, the certification part of it is a little bit easier. So I would encourage you to, if you're hesitating, call David. We'll sort you out.
Well, thanks, Steve. Yeah, and just for me, there's a lot of standards out there. So if you need help to navigate through the standards, what they are, what's the intent of them, by all means, I'm sure our contact information will be left at the end there. But feel free to reach out about it with any requests.
Fantastic. And I'll keep on my side, I'll keep teaching about standards and importance and about just quality management processes and things in general. Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you both. It's a pleasure to talk about standards. It's a topic of conversation I always enjoy. So just thank you again.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Right.